Hello and welcome to Global Lens. Over the next 30 minutes, we put the spotlight on all the top stories from around the world. I'm Parikshit Luthra. These are the big global headlines we're tracking. The United States and China avoid triple-digit tariffs on each other's goods, agreed to extend the trade truce by another 90 days. US retailers get ready to ramp up inventories ahead of the holiday season at the end of this year. European leaders say Ukraine should have the freedom to decide its future ahead of the summit between President Trump and President Putin on the 15th of August. Trump appears to entertain the idea of giving away parts of Ukraine to Russia, sparking panic in Brussels. Sam Altman hits back at Elon Musk after the Tesla CEO accuses Apple of favoring OpenAI on its App Store. Altman calls Musk's allegations remarkable and accuses him of promoting his own firms and ventures using his own social media platform X. Let's go straight to the market action. Shares on Wall Street surged as US inflation remained steady at 2.7%. 10-year bond yields drop as inflation data bolstered speculation about a possible rate cut in September. US and China's trade truce extension also lifted the global market sentiment today. Here's how Asian markets fared. Indian benchmark indices witnessed a sell-off in the last hour to end nearly 0.5% lower. Japan's Nikkei hit a record high, while China's Shanghai Composite surged 0.5%. Hong Kong's Hang Seng recorded minor gains, while South Korea's Kospi fell. Most European stocks also edged higher. Now the big story we are tracking. US President Donald Trump has extended the trade truce with China till mid-November, just hours before the previous truce deadline was set to expire. President Trump wrote on social media, and I quote, "I have just signed an executive order that will extend the tariff suspension on China for another 90 days. All other elements of the agreement will remain the same." End of quote. China's Commerce Ministry too confirmed the extension, saying Beijing is suspending additional tariffs on US goods for 90 days. It is also postponing the decision on restricting trade and investment with some American companies during this period. As per their previous agreement, Chinese goods will continue to face 30% tariffs in the US, while US goods will face 10% tariffs in China. The pause averts the triple-digit tariffs and buys time for the world's two largest economies to work out a proper trade deal. The White House fact sheet says that U.S. goods trade deficit with China was nearly $300 billion in 2024, and the deficit is already decreasing. It adds that each round of talks with China is strengthening economic cooperation. Joining us now is Scott Kennedy, Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Scott Kennedy, thank you very much for joining us on the program. How do you see the wording of the White House fact sheet, statements from the Chinese side? Do you think the fact that this trade truce has been extended for another 90 days, does it show that President Trump's trade strategy vis-a-vis China is working, or does it show that it's not working?
I don't think we have a final verdict on whether it's working or not working, but it's clear to me that both sides want to try and keep relations from escalating and from tariffs going back to where they were in early April. The U.S. Trade deficit, as you reported, is down significantly. Actually, it's been down a lot over the last 6 years, but U.S. exports are also down. So on the economics, it's not really clear yet that things are working, but they both want to keep things relatively calm. And I think they both want to eventually meet later this year. And this extending the ceasefire makes that possible.
Why do you think both sides have not been able to figure out a trade deal as yet? Why do you think it's difficult? Or is it just about Putin and Xi meeting, and there will be a headline that Donald Trump would announce?
No, I think those who are expecting a deal to have been negotiated by now are quite impatient. And arriving at a deal that addresses the serious long-term challenges that the U.S. faces with China with regard to industrial policy, economic security, that's a multi-year effort. And what the two sides have been engaged in terms of discussion so far since April has really just been about trying to get China to resume its export of rare earths and processed rare earths. And so the discussions that occurred in Geneva and then London and Stockholm were almost entirely about that issue. They've now basically resolved that problem. And so it's really from now until the end of the year, well, they'll begin to try to tackle some of those broader challenges. And so I don't think that one should have any illusions that they're going to strike a deal this week. I think you need to be looking toward late October, early November, when this next ceasefire this deadline is supposed to be extended for some kind of new news like that.
Right. Scott, if you could also help us understand the significance of this unusual arrangement, NVIDIA and AMD agreeing to pay 15% of revenues from chip sales to China to the US government. How do you think this will impact things, other companies doing business with China, and how do you think China may react?
Yeah, I have to tell you, it's one of the most bizarre arrangements I've ever heard of, at least for the United States, where we have a free market economy usually, and we try to differentiate between national security issues and business. I think those in the U.S. and others watching who are worried about American national security and sharing technology with China that could be diverted for defense purposes don't see any benefit in the U.S. essentially taxing these sales to China because the sales would go through. Those who don't see the supply of these chips as endangering American national security would also be scratching their head and wondering why on earth the US government should get a cut of the business. I think this really only helps NVIDIA to get over these odd kinds of new regulatory hurdles the Trump administration has imposed. And it helps China get access to these chips while they're also working on domestic chips. What this means for others, whether this sets a precedent and other businesses that export to China are going to have to essentially pay export taxes to the US government, we don't know. That seems to be in violation of the US Constitution. But as anyone watching American politics these days know, we're in a different era.
Right. Do you think if you compare negotiations between US and China in Trump 2.0 to his first term, who do you think has greater leverage in the talks now?
I think there's two big differences about the negotiations between the first and the second term. During the first term, the Trump administration was really laser focused on China and the deficit and not looking at broader issues. This time in Trump 2.0, China is just a small piece of the much broader equation of the US effort to totally restructure the international trading system from MFN and national treatment toward preferential trade arrangements, country by country, product by product. The US is biting off a lot. In that regard, it's certainly shown that it has a lot of leverage against many countries and can impose pain, including against India and many US allies. In the case of the trading negotiations with China, China has been able to use its dominance of rare earth elements and processed rare earths to get the US to push back. And so, what we've seen since early April is a slow backtracking of the US with regard to its tariffs and capping its export controls. And so, I think the Chinese actually feel this time around, so far, they're getting the better outcome of these negotiations, and they seem pretty optimistic about where things are going.
Right. Donald Trump has been threatening many countries with very high tariffs, very strong penalties, but not China. What do you think about the ability of China to inflict damage, not just on US, but on other countries as well, if US-China relations were to go down? And
Sure.
how much of this Donald Trump really understands? He's a very shrewd businessman, but how much of this is he taking into cognizance?
Sure. So let's first just set things straight in terms of tariffs. So, yes, US tariffs towards China dropped from 145% to 30%. But you also have to remember that the U.S. has these fentanyl tariffs still on China and the legacy tariffs from the first Trump administration and from the Biden administration. So we're still looking somewhere around 50% tariffs on average towards Chinese goods that the U.S. has. And that's amazingly high, far higher than the 3% tariffs that the U.S. had on China at the beginning of the first Trump administration. Now, they haven't increased them dramatically in the past few months, but we shouldn't get comfortable with the level that the tariffs are right now. I do think the Chinese have been able to resist tariffs going back up further and push back because of their use of the rare earths card. They know that this card has a shelf life of only 2 to 3 more years once the U.S. and others develop alternative sources of rare earth elements, magnets, and other kinds of processed rare earths, but they've used it now to good effect. I think it's amazing that the Trump administration didn't really consider the possibility that the Chinese would use this. But it's also important to recognize that the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration also did very little to prepare the U.S. for this eventuality. And so this is really a bipartisan failure on the behalf of the United States to be prepared for this vulnerability. And the Chinese have other things that they could potentially do as well.
Yeah, over-dependence on Chinese supply chains, that of course has been a problem with successive administrations. My final question to you would be on India. Trump has been very hard on India, but not on China. Now, China is also the biggest buyer of fossil fuels from Russia. India is a big buyer of crude oil too, not as much as as China. But why do you think India is getting this treatment and not China?
It's definitely a double standard for sure. And the Trump administration does not have a consistent approach towards countries around the world. I think he really wants a big deal with China. And of course, the US China trade relationship is significantly larger than the US India one. But he doesn't see India as a strategic ally the way the Biden administration did, because he doesn't see the US and China in this strategic competition over alternative systems. And so as a result, his approach towards India is not based on his concerns about China and looking for expanding the alliance on economic or security grounds. And so I think that's why we're seeing such an about face in the U.S. approach towards India over the last few months.
All right, Scott Kennedy, it's a pleasure having you on CNBC TV 18 on our program Global Lens. Thank you once again for being with us. Moving on, a quick look now at the other headlines. At least 89 Palestinians, including 31 aid seekers, have been killed in Israeli attacks across Gaza in the past 24 hours. 5 more Palestinians, including 2 children, have starved to death in the enclave. According to Gaza's health ministry, the total number of hunger-related deaths now stands at 227. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has accused Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu of living in denial over the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza. His statements came a day after he announced that Australia will recognize Palestinian statehood at the UN after similar moves by the UK, France and Canada. President Donald Trump has threatened to pursue a major lawsuit against Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, intensifying his pressure on the central bank to cut interest rates. In a social media post, Trump said the lawsuit would target Powell's handling of renovations at the Fed's headquarters in Washington, D.C. However, Trump did not offer clarity on whether a lawsuit was in the works. The United States has designated the Balochistan Liberation Army and its armed wing, the Majid Brigade, as a foreign terrorist organization. The group has been linked to several fatal attacks in Pakistan. It had also claimed responsibility for hijacking of the Jafar Express train traveling from Quetta to Peshawar in March 2025. The designation coincides with Pakistan's Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir's visit to the US. US President Donald Trump has deployed the National Guard to Washington, D.C. and taken control of its police force. Trump describes Washington, D.C. as lawless, but this claim is sharply at odds with official crime statistics. India and China are set to resume direct flight connections as soon as next month. Bloomberg has reported that airlines in India have been asked by the government to prepare flights to China at a short notice. An official announcement could come during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit at the end of August in China. Remember, passenger flights between India to China were suspended in 2020 after the COVID-19 pandemic. Time for a short break, but don't go anywhere. The European Union calls for an emergency virtual meeting tomorrow with President Trump and President Zelensky. This comes amidst concerns that Trump and Putin meeting will sideline Ukraine. We discuss more with former diplomat Casey Singh. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Global Lens. President Donald Trump will join European leaders, including Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, for an emergency virtual summit tomorrow. The call, organized by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, comes ahead of Friday's meeting in Alaska between Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin on the Ukraine war. Reports suggest that the summit will likely focus on pressure options against Russia, the status of Ukrainian territory seized by Moscow, security guarantees for Kyiv, and the sequencing of potential peace talks. 26 member states of the European Union have already issued a joint statement in support of Ukraine, welcoming Trump's efforts to end the war. However, they stress that Ukraine must have the freedom to decide their future, and any path to peace cannot be decided without Ukraine. Putin's ally, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, was the only EU leader who declined to endorse the statement. Speaking to reporters at the White House, Trump said he could tell within 2 minutes of the meeting Putin whether progress was possible, adding that land swapping would be on the agenda in Alaska. He also voiced frustration over Zelensky's insistence that any peace deal be approved through a national referendum. Zelensky has also rejected the idea that Ukraine must commit to give up land to secure a ceasefire. Joining us now on the show is Casey Singh, former diplomat and strategic affairs expert. Ambassador Singh, thank you very much for being with us on the program. Trump has suggested that territory could be traded between Russia and Ukraine to arrive at a deal. How difficult is this going to be? For example, just imagine Ukraine would never want to give up Donbass.
That is true, although in the last day or so, President Trump has climbed down a little. He had begun by saying that, but then now he's saying, I'm just going there to figure out what's on Putin's mind. So he's talking less about a deal and imposing it on Ukraine and more about seeing if a middle ground can be found. And the Europeans are keeping up their pressure, and hence the teleconference between them, because for them, a Ukraine settlement is very important because they don't want a Russian victory or a perceived Russian victory, because that'll have other consequences for European countries bordering Russia.
It is being said by Western media reports that just the presence of Putin in America to meet Donald Trump, possibly shaking hands with him on camera, is a victory in itself. Europe and European leaders clearly worried, and they said that any decision must be with the participation of Ukraine and in the interest of Ukrainian people. Do you think Trump is going to keep the concerns of European allies in mind?
Look, with President Trump, you don't know what he'll do. He may say something else tomorrow. But he is essentially negotiating. He will put pressure on different countries. He will see if he can push Putin. But if he can't push him, he's capable of also just shaking hands with him. In the past, we've seen a gradual evolution of his position from being opposed to Ukraine and tilting towards Russia at the beginning of his presidency to now even resuming arms shipments. And now he's again going back a little. But this is part of his negotiating strategy. He always keeps the other country guessing. He will maximize what he wants, then he will step back, and he will keep trying this. But what he doesn't realize is that when it comes to countries, it's not for a Ukrainian president to decide what can or cannot be done. We haven't had an election there in a while. And he's absolutely, Zelensky is right that he'll have to have a referendum. He has to carry the country with him if he is ceding territory. It also remains to be seen, will Russia settle for what it has already occupied? Or does it want Donbass, which is what he wants, the entire eastern province of Donbass, a region of Donbass, which it doesn't still have. But it's controlling almost a third of Ukrainian territory.
Right.
Now, will it settle for that? I think that remains to be seen.
Do you think there could be a possibility of Trump unilaterally announcing a deal on Friday night? Or do you think they will just assess the situation? He'll gauge the mood, as he said that I'll get to know in the first 2 minutes if there can be a deal or not, and that's about it.
I don't think he can announce a deal because the deal involves Ukraine, and I'm sure the Europeans are just going to put immense amount of pressure on him. They've already had a meeting with the vice president. They've been pushing for that. They are the ones who told Zelensky to climb down, to not take on Trump after that horrible White House meeting between Zelensky and Trump. But they're also now throwing their weight behind him. They are talking in terms of, uh, self-dependence as far as security is concerned. They've pleased Trump by saying their defense budgets will go up to 3.5%. But more than that, they're also talking in terms of really creating a defense which is not totally dependent or largely dependent on the Americans. So there's a transition taking place, but the Europeans don't want to offend America. They've just had a trade deal on July 28th, 27th. They don't want that to be scrapped. But at the same time, they can't allow Putin to be seen as a victor because that has future geostrategic implications for Europe.
Right. When it comes to India, Ambassador K.C. Singh, India would be watching very, very carefully if there can be a deal or not. Do you think the US threat of additional tariffs on India for purchase of Russian oil, which could realistically lead to reduction of India's oil purchases from Russia over the next few months, is this a cause for worry of Putin? Is this a pressure tactic that could work in the negotiations between Trump and Putin on Friday?
Well, so far he's not shown because the Chinese, who are bigger purchasers of Russian oil, have said they're not going to listen to America. And we were discussing earlier with Mr. Kennedy. He was saying this, that the Chinese have been able to push back because they have control over rare earths. So if he can't push the Chinese, simply getting the Indians out of it, India has already been reducing the import of Russian oil. And also, I think the discount has gone down quite a bit from what it was earlier. So India's wanting to diversify because we don't want the trade war with the US to escalate. But one good thing is if there is a deal over Ukraine, then one of the things that Putin would want is the Americans to lift the sanctions. So if America is lifting the sanctions, there's no question of going after India. So that means at least the 25% extra tariffs for oil imports will disappear or should disappear. So we have a vested interest in a positive outcome because that will remove Russia as an element in Indo-US trade negotiations. Then we just await the American delegation to see how we deal with the commercial and trading demands that they have.
Right. Of course, a lot could develop, a lot could change by the end of this week. And that will also decide what will happen when the trade negotiators will come on the 25th of August for the 6th round of negotiations. Ambassador K.C. Singh, was a pleasure having you on Global Lens to talk about the EU, the European Union virtual summit with President Trump right now ahead of the EU-US summit in Alaska.
Thank you.
On Final
You're
Cut
welcome.
this evening, a Chinese Navy warship collided with a Chinese Coast Guard ship while chasing a Philippine patrol boat in the South China Sea. The incident occurred in the disputed Scarborough Shoal, where Philippine Coast Guard officials were distributing aid to fishermen. China confirmed that a confrontation took place and accused the Philippines of forcibly intruding into Chinese waters. That's all for today on Global Lens. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.